I can't tell you what an honour it is for me to introduce the Honourable Michael Kirby to you today. And in case you're wondering about those initials after his name, for those of you who haven't yet received any honours, AC is the Companion of the Order of Australia, and then CMG is the Companion of the Order of St Michael and St George, which, as Michael pointed out to me, is pretty damn well close to God. So we really have a highly elevated member of the Australian community with us today. I know he probably needs no real introduction, but could I tell you that he accepted his invitation today to pay his respects to public school secondary principals in Victoria, which is marvellous of him. And not only that, he arose from his bed at 3 a.m. to attend to his emails and do a day's work in his office before he got on a plane and flew down here. So he hasn't come down on the back of an elephant with people waving palms. So, it's no mean feat. As you know, he's a very strong advocate of everything that's good, including public state education and, of course, his main driver, which is social justice. He recently received that most prestigious award for meritorious support for public education, and we particularly like his description as a National Trust Australian living treasure. Now, what we're going to do with Michael today is he'll speak for about half an hour, and he's going to have a microphone up there, but really he would then love for half an hour to answer any questions you might have. So, please think as you're listening to him, here's my opportunity to speak to this man. Or what do I want to say to him? So, on your behalf, please, I would like to welcome the Honourable Michael Kirby. Thank you.
You see standing before you a proud product of public education. Personally, I never call it government education. That's a term that may be used in legislation down here, but it's a term used by some people to try to tie public schools into governments. Governments come and go. Premiers come and go. But public education stays on. And I never call it state education myself, because that conjures up image of V.I. Lenin and the state, or the Nazis and the state. Public education is there for everyone, and that is why I love it. And I'm very proud to be here with the principals in Victoria, and I pay my respects to you. I express my thanks to you. You don't get enough money and you don't get enough thanks, but from me, you're not going to get any more money, but you're certainly going to get thanks, because I can remember every one of the teachers in public education who taught me. My entire education in schooling was in public schools. I started out at the North Strathfield Public School in Sydney, just about a kilometre from my parents' home, and in those days we all walked, and I had a marvellous first teacher, Miss Pontifex. I've learned lately that she was Anne Pontifex, but of course in those days we had no idea what her first name was, and would never have dreamed of calling her by her first name. But since I've started speaking about my teachers and Miss Pontifex, a number of teachers have written to me and told me what a wonderful mentor she was for them. Well, she was a great teacher for me. She taught me the alphabet, and these were in the years just before the end of the Second World War. And it was on a upstairs at the infant school, built in 1926, still then in 1944, relatively new building, a very light schoolroom overlooking a golf links in North Strathfield in Sydney, and I can still remember the A, B and C, etc. on the board, and how we were taught the rudiments of writing and reading, and how in the second class we were taught to write, and we all got slope cards, and we all used inkwells. This is really dinosaur stuff, but I then learned to love not only my teachers, but also my fellow pupils. The infant school at North Strathfield was co-ed, but when I passed through the hands of Miss Pontifex and Mrs. C, who was 2A, into 3A, I had Mrs. Godwin. That was in the big school. And you went into the big school at North Strathfield, through a little fence, and all asphalt it was. It's built on Corries Avenue and Concord Road, and the traffic going by on Concord Road, I can still vividly remember, included lots of trucks with Red Cross signs. They were khaki and a white circle in the middle and the Red Cross, going up to the Concord Repatriation General Hospital, which was about 2 kilometres down the road. We, the children of that school, were sat in the footpath to watch the Governor-General go by, and we all waved flags, and on one occasion we were sat there to watch Eleanor Roosevelt go by. I distinctly remember that occasion. I don't have a vivid recollection of Eleanor Roosevelt, though I've read a lot about her since, and of course she was a most admirable person. And after the war, she became extremely important in the matter of social justice, because she was the chair of the committee of the United Nations organisation, this new body which was established in 1945 to establish the principles of human rights. And that committee drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In the big school, I had Mrs. Godwin, and Mr. Casma, and the school had radios, wirelesses up in the corner where we would listen to the ABC programs for schools. I'm sure they must have also come down to Victoria, because this was the ABC, and there was a wonderful program called Australia and the World, which had Mr. H.D. Black, later Sir Herman Black, a proud product of public education, by the way, and he was subsequently the Chancellor of the University of Sydney. And he, I remember, told us about the onrush of the communist Red Army in China, sweeping aside the Kuomintang under General Chiang Kai-shek, to establish the People's Republic of China. But I also remember a marvellous instructor in song, Terence Hunt. I don't know if anybody remembers Terry Hunt. He had a wonderful baritone voice. And I remember one hymn, it was a hymn, but it didn't have a religious content. It was in our school magazine, and it was, "These things shall be. These things shall be, a loftier race than all the world hath known shall rise, with light of freedom in their souls, and flame of science in their eyes." Science and knowledge were the principles I was instructed in my public education. Now in New South Wales, as you would all know, we have and have had for a very long time a system of selective schools. And in the end of my 4th year, my mother received a notification that I'd done reasonably well in an IQ test, which is how they used to select them in those days, and that she was to bring Michael into the Department of Education in Bridge Street, in the what is now called the Wilkins Room, named after the first Director General of Public Education in New South Wales, on the top floor of that building to do the finals. And apparently I must have done all right in that, because I was then selected to go to the Summerhill Opportunity School. This was an Opportunity C class. I don't know, Opportunity A class I think was for disadvantaged people. And Opportunity B, I never worked out what that was, but Opportunity C was for so-called gifted children, children who did well in IQ. And so I had to go by train to Summerhill School, where we were divided from boys and girls separately, and I was there educated by Mr. Gorringe. It was Mr. Gorringe who introduced the class to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I don't know if this happens now, I don't think it happens in New South Wales. We were educated in that. It's very hard to explain to people today how frightened everybody was in 1949. We knew this war had happened. We knew that many, many people, including our own brave soldiers, had died. And we knew, most especially, that these big bombs had been dropped in Japan, and that unless we could get control of that, then the future of humanity was really at risk. This is still the truth in our world, but we don't sort of think about it now. We've got through 50 years, 60 years without blowing ourselves to bits, but it's still a very important problem. And the theory of Eleanor Roosevelt and her committee was that unless we could deal with the problems of human rights and ensure the respect for fundamental human rights, then we would go on having wars, and now we have the atom bombs, we would end up destroying all of humanity and all the beauties of the world. And so that's what Mr. Gorringe taught me. And he was succeeded by Mr. Redmond and then by Mr. Tennant. Mr. Tennant had a motor car accident, and so he was taken off the job, and the poor principal of Summerhill School had to be dragged in to fill the space for Mr. Tennant for the 2 or 3 weeks that he was likely to be off work. And so I came to know Mr. Gibbons, the principal. He was your equivalent at the Summerhill School. He was the principal of the whole school, and therefore he was also in charge of the opportunity classes in the school, and he had to take over control of us. On one occasion, I accidentally spilt the ink. Literally, I blotted my copybook, and ink came onto my departmental copybook. Don't know if it was the same here in Victoria, but they were green-covered copybooks with lines in them, and I had this big splunge of ink on my copybook, so I tore out the pages. Mr. Gibbons, who had a perfect sense of weight, picked up my book and said, "This book," I'm sure none of you would do this to a small, impressionable child, "this book is light. This book is light. You have been tearing pages out of this book. Do you know this book is the King's property? You have torn pages out of the King's property. Come out here, you're going to get the cane." And principals in those days, I don't know if it's still true in Victoria, I don't think so, had the right and the power, and where the case of the behaviour was egregious, the duty to administer the cane. And so I had to put my hand up, and I got 2 of the best. It wasn't a 6er, which was the limit imposed on the principal, but it was still the most humiliating moment that I had had in my life to that moment, inflicted on me by a principal. Mr. Gibbons had one of those badges that they had if they'd fought in the First World War. It was the AIF First World War badge. A lot of teachers in those days had fought in the First and then the Second World War. Mr. Gorringe had fought in the Second World War, and we think he had a bit of shell shock, and he wasn't at the school for very long, so he was replaced by Mr. Redmond. But Mr. Gibbons was a real tough principal, and he administered the cane, and I've never been the same since that moment. So I owe a lot to Mr. Gibbons, and in the presence of his successors, I say a grateful pupil's thanks for the administration to me of chastisement when I didn't deserve it. It resulted in me being a judge. How will I say this? When I went into the Court of Criminal Appeal was red robes. Civil appeals were black robes. As you know, lawyers love dressing up, and we were colour coordinated and colour identified. So when I walked into the Court of Criminal Appeals, it was always like the scene in Fidelio, where the prisoners coming out of the stage on liberation to Beethoven's magnificent music cry, "Freedom, freedom." And that's what the prisoners used to say when I came in to the Court of Criminal Appeal, and all because of Mr. Gibbons. I had a very strong sense of due process and of justice and fairness, and this I can attribute to a school principal in New South Wales. I then went to Fort Street High School, which is the oldest continuously operating public school in our country. It was established in 1849. It's the second oldest continuous school in the nation. The oldest is the King's School at Parramatta in Sydney, a private and Anglican school, but Fort Street is the oldest continuously operating public school, and it was established by Governor Fitzroy, the Governor of New South Wales at that time. And Governor Fitzroy sought to establish schools on the model of the so-called national schools that had been created in Ireland. The British, having lost the American colonies at the end of the 18th century, were determined, insofar as they could, not to lose any more, and certainly not to lose the Irish kingdom, which was then bound to the United Kingdom. And so they established these so-called national schools in the hope that they could bring Protestant and Catholic children together in the national schools. And Fort Street was called originally a national school, and it was founded on the model, and Wilkins was brought out from England as the first principal of the school, and he became the first headmaster of the school back in 1849. The churches opposed Governor Fitzroy's moves. They fought it tooth and nail. They fought it continuously. They're still fighting public education. They're still, or some of them, seeking to establish inroads into the space of public education and to denigrate public education. And as far as I'm concerned, that must not be allowed to succeed. It is extremely important that the high ideals of public education should be promoted, and those like me who secured the benefits of public education should never hesitate to speak up for the values of public education, to defend it, to support it, and especially at a time when it is facing crises of funding and other crises in the community. Eventually, however, despite the opposition of the churches, led, I might say, by the Anglican Church, the Church of England as it was called then, but also with some opposition from the Roman Catholic Church, eventually in the 1870s, as you know, the great movement gained momentum. And it was a movement which had no real parallel anywhere in the world. The closest that it came to it was in the United States of America, where following the revolution they had established pockets of public education on the principle that every child in the Republic had a right to have a free education. But the notion of establishing continent-wide in Australia the ideal that every child in Australia, regardless of the wealth, religion, background, class, or any other feature of their parents, would have a right to free education, was an idea that was eventually supported by Henry Parkes in New South Wales, and it led to the Public Instruction Act in the 1870s and to the Public Education Act of 1888, and there were parallel developments here in this state. In fact, on Monday night at RMIT University here in Melbourne, I'm delivering the Higginbotham Lecture in honour of Justice Higginbotham, who, as a politician earlier, had been one of the great proponents of public education and of the compromise that was eventually struck with the churches, under which public education got off to a start in Victoria. Stuart McIntyre, the Professor of History from Melbourne University, is giving a lecture first on Higginbotham himself, and my duty will be to look at Higginbotham's legacy and what we have to learn from it and what dangers are presented to it as at this moment. But that isn't my subject to you today. The subject for you today is public education and the values of public education, particularly in relation to social justice. It wouldn't be surprising that public education is devoted to principles of social justice, because public education has the most connection with the issues of social justice and has had that connection ever since the start. I saw a recent paper by David Collis of the University of Melbourne, and in it he gives the figures. 67% of all pupils in Australia go to public schools and are educated in public schools. 85% of Indigenous Australians are educated in public schools. 78% of students with disabilities are educated in public schools. 83% of students in remote areas of Australia are educated in public schools, and 79% of children in the lowest socio-economic sectors of the population are educated in public schools. We heard a lot of this in the last lecture given by Stephen Lamb. I was very glad to hear the tail end of his remarks, and I didn't understand it all because of the fact that this is a world of acronyms, which if you're not in your world, you don't know all those acronyms, and therefore half of it went over my head because I missed the acronyms that you have to know. But I got the general message, and he was, as it were, building on these percentages to indicate the extra burden that falls upon public education and the need, therefore, to support the changes that are essential to properly fund it. The principles of public education were that it would be free, that it would be secular, and that it would be compulsory. And the free part of it is now coming under threat and danger by suggestions that there should be introduced a levy on parents which will make any parents whose combined income is over $150,000 pay a levy somewhat like the Medicare levy in order to compensate the community for the fact that they're getting free education. I hope that that never comes to pass. It may simply be something that is being floated at the moment, but if it happens, I would hope that we remind fellow Australians of the great importance of the ideal of public education and that it should be there as of right to children across our continent as it has been since 1888. Secondly, there's the secular principle, and the secular principle has also been coming under opposition I see this opposition as really basically a continuation of the struggle that Governor Fitzroy had back in the 1840s. And this is the notion that you can't educate children without a religious component, and that therefore that has to be given to them at school, and therefore that you have to break down the secular principle and provide for religious education in public schools. I also believe that that should be strongly resisted. I myself continue to adhere to the religion in which I was raised, which was Anglican. And at my schools I always went to so-called scripture classes, and probably if I was still around at school today, though that is hard for me to imagine, I would still do so. In fact, at Fort Street we had the great blessing in the Anglican group, which was the biggest group of the scripture class, on Thursday mornings, to be educated by Stuart Barton Babbage, who was the Dean of Sydney and later came down here to Melbourne and became the Dean, the Anglican Dean of Melbourne. But now, since the Howard government, supported by the Rudd government and supported by the Gillard government, we have the chaplaincy scheme. And $500 million have been spent on the chaplaincy scheme. Just imagine what could be done with $500 million in public education for the needs of public education with that money. It's an awful lot of money, and I was really shocked to hear when I was speaking to those who were giving me a briefing on the chaplaincy scheme as it operates in Victoria, and it's probably the same in New South Wales, that people are not chaplains who come for the 1 hour of scripture a week. They are chaplains who are posted to the school, and some of them have teaching responsibilities in the school, but they are not the 1 hour derogation from the principle of secularism. They're around the place. And I think that is really something which would have shocked Higginbotham and would have shocked the founders of public secular education, because it gives a religious presence in the school that has not been a feature of public education in this country. Now, don't think that doesn't matter. I had it explained that effectively they are doing what in my time was done by some school counsellors, and that school counsellors have never been properly funded in this state. But the school counsellor that we had at my school was a teacher, and he was a trained teacher, a secular teacher. He wasn't there to proclaim a particular religious viewpoint. And I think it's extremely dangerous myself to have this exception to the principle of secularism gaining ground, supported by $500 million since the chaplaincy scheme was introduced. If you look at the areas of social justice that we've had in our country that have changed in my lifetime, they would be these. First of all, women's education and women's rights. And it's public education that advanced women's equal right to social justice and to their own fulfilment as citizens and individuals. Aboriginal are, as I've said, overwhelmingly educated in public schools, and they are overwhelmingly deprived of full equality because of lack of proper housing, lack of proper health care, and on some occasions lack of access to all the educational opportunities that other Australians enjoy. But they are a huge responsibility of the public system. White Australia was a phenomenon I grew up with. The White Australia policy and the attitude of denigration of people who are non-Caucasian, the difficulty that non-Caucasians had in getting into the country. When I was at Fort Street, there were about 9 Asian Australians in the whole school of 800. Nowadays, about 40% or 50% of the school are Asian Australians. One of the boys who was a prefect 4 years ahead of me at the school was John Yu. John Yu later became a professor of paediatrics and Chancellor of the University of New South Wales and Australian of the Year. And I asked John Yu, what was it like growing up in white Australia? He said it wasn't very nice, but that's something in which we made changes. But most of the Asian Australian and non-Caucasian students are the responsibility of public education. Disabled Australians likewise, and people of no religion, an increasing cohort if you can take the census as a guide. 20% of Australians now say they have no religion, and they have a right, and their children have a right, to be educated in a way that doesn't make them feel second class because they don't have a religious assignment. But the group that was almost invisible when I was at school, and which I had the most reason to be interested in, were the gays, homosexuals, sexual minorities. And I have to say to you, standing here now, I never once in all my education, that being gay was something that made me second class. I never felt it at home, I never felt it at school. And I think that had a lot to do with the public education ethos. It had a lot to do with the fact that it was a secular space. It had a lot to do with the fact that there wasn't a chaplain hovering around who might be telling people that I had an inclination to evil. Because that's what's said in, you have to face the fact. This is what is said in catechisms and instruction, not only of the Roman Catholic Church, but also of some Anglicans, and also of Islam and other people of religion. And so this is a feature of religious instruction, and it's a very important feature so far as education is concerned. Very recently I went to a major religious institution which is involved in education, and I asked a leading professor there, would it be possible to have a GLBT students association in this place? And the answer was, oh, that would create many difficulties. Well, I don't think it would create any, I hope it would create no difficulties whatsoever in a public school, and it doesn't create any difficulties in a public institution of learning and education. And this is the issue that we have to face, that insofar as religion has a space in public education, it should be, in my humble opinion, confined. We should adhere to the secular principle. We should ensure that it is not eroded, and we should ensure that every child that comes into the care of public schools feels fully accepted, not second class, and can associate with other people, straight or gay, that is of the same view. And I would challenge everyone here today to make sure that that continues to be the case in public schools. Never did I feel that that was absent in my schools. Never did I feel any bullying in my schools. Never did I feel that there was some humiliation that was attempted to be imposed on me, but that is not uniformly the case in educational institutions in this state or this country. And it's the duty of public education to make sure that it continues in the public schools. Now finally, I want to say this. Values matter. I get as mad as hell when I hear people say public schools are devoid of values. When I think of my teachers and their wonderful values, and their devotion, their lifelong devotion from the beginning of my school education to the end. And I think of the education in democracy, in human rights, in equality, in the fair go, which is so deeply embedded in our country. I attribute a lot of that to teachers in public schools. But values matter everywhere else too. Values matter in our parliaments. Values matter in our courts. So I just thought I would have a look at the numbers of justices of the High Court of Australia, the court in which I had the honour to serve, who were appointed in recent years, just to see what the balance of the values of public education were brought into the high offices in the courts, where the values affect the decisions. Values affect decisions because you get an ambiguity in the Constitution, you get an uncertainty in the statute, you get a gap in the common law, and your values inevitably affect the way you fill the gap or construe the statute or the Constitution. And so the figures are these. In the Whitlam government, there were 2 justices appointed to the High Court, and one of them, Justice Murphy, was educated in public schools. He went to Kensington Public School and Sydney Boys High School. In the Fraser government, there were 5 justices appointed, and 2 of the 5 were educated in public schools, Sir Harry Gibbs and Sir Darrell Dawson. In the Hawke-Keating government, there were 6 appointees to the High Court, and only 1 was appointed from public school. In the Howard government, there were 6 appointees to the High Court, only 1 came from public schools. And in the Rudd-Gillard government, there have been 5, only 1 from public schools. That means Whitlam was 1 out of 2, Fraser was 2 out of 5, Hawke-Keating was 1 out of 6, Howard 1 out of 6, Rudd-Gillard 1 out of 5. During almost the entire time I sat on the High Court of Australia, I was the only justice of the court whose education had been in public schools. And people sometimes say, why did you dissent? Why did you disagree? Why did you disagree with the others? Why couldn't you have been more agreeable? Why didn't you see it the way the others saw it? Well, I was remembering North Strathfield Public School in 1948 when children came to the school from the home without proper clothing and without proper footwear. I was remembering 1943 when in the infant school the milk was always left in the sunshine, and the children from the home and some other places, the first food they got of the day was the milk with the cream on the top. I was remembering the ethos of democracy, of equality, of the humility of citizenship that I received at the hands of my teachers and my fellow pupils in public schools. It's little wonder I sometimes saw things differently, because my life's experience had been different. I went to selective schools, but please understand in Victoria this: the selective schools were still public schools. We were still proudly part of public education. We still adhered to the principles of public education. We didn't feel better than the other pupils. We just had some opportunities to fulfil what had been deemed to be gifts, and we became the flagships of public education in New South Wales. Public schools dominate the higher school certificate in New South Wales. They are the symbols of what public education can deliver, given the opportunities and given the proper funding. And so it's no wonder I was a little bit different. And I'm very grateful for the public education that I received. I made a speech when I got an honorary degree at the University of South Australia. It was in not a law graduation, but in an education graduation, so I could hardly talk to them about the Constitution or the rule against perpetuities or the Statute of Mortmain. And so I talked about public education and about funding of public education and of how important it was. And Mr. Howard, alumnus of the Canterbury Boys High School in Sydney, a selective school, rebuked me for having intruded into the space. Well, I was unrepentant then and I'm unrepentant now. Public education matters, and public education is there for everyone, and public education does the hard lifting, and public education deserves the support of the whole community, including those who send their children to private and Catholic schools. Public education is vital to the democratic ethos of Australia. All of us should support it, and the moment of truth is approaching, because the moment of truth will be within the next 2 or 3 weeks, when the issue of the Gonski report will be before the Federal Parliament. I don't know how many of you saw this morning's Age newspaper, the Age Readers Poll. Do you support the Gonski plan? Yes, 72%, no, 28%. Political resolve and decision making to defend and support public education is essential. There's been too much drift, in my humble opinion, as a citizen, to funding private and religious schools, and public education must now find its time in the sun. End of speech.